This is a production of Cornell University.
Good morning. Good afternoon. Just a word about the music before we begin today. There's a prelude and a postlude, and then there'll be a musical selection in the middle today between the presentation and the Q&A section. All three selections today are somewhat appropriate for a political day because they all deal in some respect with the utopian idea. Bashana Habana is the first piece that we'll be singing. It's an Israeli folk song whose refrain says, O Tire, next year, you will see that things will be better next year. Children will play in the yard and birds will fly again in the sunshine. The second piece, the middle piece, are the Latin words of Thomas Aquinas, a liturgical poem which salutes the utopian ideal of the 12 brethren at the supper table with the Savior. And finally today, for the postlude, Hamisha Asar, a Ladino piece. The words are the Spanish Hebrew language, Ladino, the language spoken by Sephardic Jews, for Tu B'Shavat, the Jewish holiday in the spring that celebrates the time when sap begins to flow in the trees. And this is a song that the arranger Flori Jagoda used to sing as a child in her Bosnian village. So that's the music this morning, and we'll begin with Bashana Haba'a as soon as I get back there.
That you have taken time from your busy schedules to join us for this afternoon's Sage Wednesdays program, which is sponsored by the Cornell United Religious Work and the Cornell Department of Music, as well as, in this case, the Africana Studies and Research Center as part of a series called Race and the Presidency. Sage Wednesdays allows for the expression of a public theology, what Victor Anderson of Vanderbilt University calls the deliberate use of religious languages and commitments to influence substantive public discourse. But Sage Chapel also has encouraged what Robert Bellah, the noted sociologist, has called a strong normative concern for the public good, that is, a public philosophy. Today's program reflects the concern of public philosophy with its emphasis on unconscious race and gender bias operative in the American body politic during the 2008 presidential race. Our two speakers this afternoon co-authored an article published in the Hastings Women's Law Journal on this subject. They cite that while the previous presidential primary campaign featured an African American, Senator Barack Obama, and a woman, Senator Hillary Clinton, with very real chances to win the presidency, of course this remains the case with Senator Obama, a closer analysis illustrates the manner in which race and gender placed constraints on the manner in which Senators Obama and Clinton ran their campaigns, and by extension how Senator Obama continues to run his campaign. Additionally revealing is the manner in which unconscious, subtle race and gender bias is operative during this historic run for the presidency. Biases that, as social psychologists have pointed out, are pervasive in the larger culture and influence judgments and decisions. A new variable has been introduced to the gender dynamics of this campaign with the election or the selection of Alaska Governor Sarah Palin as the Republican vice presidential candidate by Senator John McCain, coupled with controversies that extend beyond gender issues. To what extent, if at all, might the controversies related to Governor Palin intersect with the gender dynamics our speakers will address? We will leave it to our speakers to speak to these and other details. Professor Jeffrey Rachlinski is an innovative scholar in administrative law, social psychology, and the law in general. Since joining the Cornell Law School faculty in 1994, less than a year after receiving his PhD in psychology and a JD from Stanford University, Dr. Rachlinski has offered new perspectives on the influence of human psychology on decision-making by courts, administrative agencies, and regulated communities. Professor Rachlinski's unique analytical viewpoint has led him to explore varied topics in legal practice, such as litigation strategies, punitive damages, administrative law, environmental law, and products liability. One of the most versatile scholars at Cornell Law School, Professor Rachlinski has taught social and cognitive psychology for lawyers, administrative law, environmental law, civil procedures, and torts. Gregory Scott Parks is co-editor of Critical Race Realism, Intersections of Psychology, Race, and Law with Shane Jones and Jonathan Carty. His primary research focus lies at the intersection of social science, race, and law. His secondary research interest is in Black Greek letter organizations. Dr. Parks is the editor of 3 books on Black Greek letter organizations, BGLOs, as a leader in the development of a critical scholarship on these organizations. Remarkably, he edited 3 of his 4 books while a student at Cornell Law, where he earned a JD this past spring. Dr. Parks also earned a BA from Howard University, an MS from the City University of New York, and an MA and PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Kentucky. Currently, he is a clerk in the District of Columbia Court of Appeals for the 2008-2009 term. We present to you Dr. Parks and Professor Rachlinski.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So in writing this project, it's one of the difficulties, writing on this subject, one of the difficulties for both of us has been, it's sort of like building a house on sand. I'm used to having all the data and then writing the article and having a beginning, a middle, and an end to the article, and we keep writing and then having to rewrite as events keep moving. For example, we thought we sort of more or less had the article on race written near the end of August, but then Senator McCain nominated Sarah Palin as his vice presidential running mate, and that caused us to rethink a lot of it. And we've been crafting this article for quite a while, but it's a privilege to talk to this community about it. We do have our thesis, so we have our beginning and our middle, but not quite the end yet. The thesis is essentially about how unconscious bias is affecting the electorate. Now, that race is affecting the outcome of this political contest is not novel or surprising to anyone. Our particular shtick is on the role of unconscious bias. Now, it's worth at the outset noting by what exactly do we mean by that? Well, what we mean by unconscious bias is the kind of biases or habits of mind that people carry around in their heads and have very little awareness or direct access, awareness of or direct access to. We would contrast that with conscious or explicit biases that may be more familiar, right? That by a conscious or explicit bias, one can think of the sort of racial animus that one sees occasionally, unfortunately, still in the electorate, or the sort of just overt adherence to a stereotype or belief about a demographic subgroup that may not be animus so much, but is certainly troublesome and bigoted or chauvinistic in its own right. We mean to exclude those from what our topic is, not because we think there are no explicit or conscious racists out there, but that we think that in this coming election that unconscious bias has actually played a bigger role. There's very little doubt that some small percentage of the population will vote against Barack Obama explicitly, consciously, knowingly because he's an African American. We don't deny that. But we think actually that's a smaller subgroup than certainly it would have been in years past, and is smaller than the vast bulk of the electorate that nevertheless, even though they don't harbor the explicit biases, carry around unconscious habits of mind that they're not aware of that nevertheless affect how they think and have affected how this campaign is playing out. Now, why do we think that, and how do we know that the electorate harbors unconscious biases? Well, there's actually a growing body of evidence in social psychology on the extent to which ordinary adults who embrace egalitarian norms and claim not to be racist or chauvinists or bigots or the like, nevertheless can be shown to have mental associations between African Americans or women and categories that are invidious or uncomfortable for them. So the clearest data are from Mazar and Banashi and others at Harvard and other places that most white adults find it much easier to associate white faces with positive imagery than black faces, and find it much easier to associate black faces with negative or even violent imagery than positive imagery. Right, so that association is just easier, and there are lots of different ways to measure that involving sort of technical reaction time experiments and the like. But roughly 80%, however you measure it, roughly 80% of white adults in the United States just find it easier to associate white and good and black and bad. And so that unconscious bias lies out there, and we believe, and psychologists believe, has an effect on judgment and behavior. And there's evidence to support that. One great example of this is if you take folks who really score very high in their tendency to associate white and good and black and bad, and show them photographs of black faces and ask them to try to remember them. And you hook them up to sophisticated MRI machines and the like and monitor their brain activity, what you see is when they process white faces, the amygdala tends to be very active. Now, the amygdala is a part of the brain that is most closely associated with a fear or fight and flight response. Right, and so that seems to be triggered when folks who score high in this white good association are processing black faces. It's not true of them when they process white faces, And it's not true of white adults who don't have that association. So that unconscious association seems to be correlated with a particular way of mentally processing the world. Likewise, there's data that white folks who score high in this white good, black bad association treat job applicants differently. Right? So folks who have this white good association, when they interview black applicants, tend to make less eye contact, tend to express negative body language, this is passive aggressive stuff like that, and generally rate their interviewee as colder and less interesting than they do of a white interviewee, and than white adults who don't have that association. So that association seems to matter, seems to affect judgment. And exactly how does it affect judgment? Well, the folks who have it don't say, I'm not going to hire a black person. They're not overt, explicit racist. They don't say that, nor do they even think they believe it. What happens is really two things. They alter their judgment of the person in ways that look objective but aren't. And the example there would be the way they treat them in the interview. So they rate the interview as colder and less engaging. Right? And then later, when it comes time to decide who to hire, they say, well, this person was cold and not engaging. Right? So the race had an influence on that judgment and then influenced the ultimate judgment of who they hire. The second thing folks seem to do who harbor these unconscious biases is they alter how they score applicants. They alter what's important about job applicants and the like after they see a candidate who has who may be a minority and has particular skills. So for example, there's a study that suggests that whites who harbor these associations in fact will change their judgment of what they're looking for to match the white applicant's talents and to disfavor the black applicant. Right? And that's what the data sort of look like. So then when we start to apply that to the election, we start to see, well, this may make some sense out of what the campaign sort of looks like. So you see, it's interesting that this campaign has been since at least a year ago for most adults about change. We've got Change Washington, we've had Republicans for 8 years, it's time to get someone new. But then suddenly when a candidate shows up who's very new to Washington, well then suddenly experience starts to matter for a lot of voters. Ooh, we need an experienced person who wants to change, that it's changing the playing field a good deal in the same way employers seem to do sometimes as well. Likewise, you sort of see, in New York we don't see many of the campaign ads. I've been traveling for about a week and you do see nothing but campaign ads in Missouri and Pennsylvania and the like, and they're scary. They're real efforts to make people, the McCain ads are efforts to be frightening, and they try to paint Obama as a risky, the word risky appears in most of the campaign ads. And while that could be true that could just be true if Obama had been white as well, it does sound an awful lot like the underlying social psychological research, right, where this particular fear response seems to be activated, right, that you see that for folks who score high in this white good association who evaluate black candidates. And I should turn it over to Greg. So then we start to think like social scientists. That's a nice narrative, but what hard evidence can we come up with to suggest that unconscious bias is really playing an important role in the campaign?
And the four things that, well, we look at a number of different issues, but I'll distill them down to four different things. One is we look at polling data, specifically to see what specific variables help us come to terms with the fact that there might be unconscious bias out there in the electorate. We don't have implicit association test data, which is the typical measure used to assess unconscious bias of all forms on each individual voter. So how do we get at that? Well, one thing that we know is that political conservatism, whether one is very liberal or very conservative, is associated with unconscious bias, and that individuals who tend to be more right-leaning on the political spectrum, whether they are indeed Republicans or just right-leaning Democrats, tend to harbor stronger unconscious anti-black bias. So we also find that there are various proxies for political conservatism: age, education, and SES. Those who tend to be older tend to be more conservative. Those who tend to be less educated tend to be more conservative. And those who tend to be poor tend to be more conservative. So one would expect that whether one looks at Senator Obama or during the primary Senator Clinton, that those who were older, less educated, and poorer would harbor stronger levels of unconscious race bias and maybe unconscious gender bias. And what we find is that Senator Clinton tended to get the vote of older, less educated, and poorer voters, which suggests that there's stronger unconscious bias among those, at least in those demographic areas, who are voting for Senator Clinton and against Senator Obama. And this sort of strikes against the notion that those individuals are harboring strong unconscious gender bias, or that the unconscious race bias is sort of checking the unconscious gender bias. And now one could say, well, this is just looking at one set of polls. What we also find is that there was a Newsweek poll which created what they called a racial resentment index. And those individuals who scored higher on the racial resentment index tended to vote for Senator Clinton more than they voted for Senator Obama. And some of the variables that correlated with the racial resentment index were age, education, SES, and also which part of the country one was from. And then thirdly, there's another poll that came out just a few weeks ago conducted by social scientists at Stanford, suggesting that within the Democratic primaries, certain variables predicted Democrats not likely to vote for Obama based on race, and part of those variables at least was seen with regards to the variables that we find in the other two polls. So secondly, we look at what has long been termed the Bradley effect. During the 1980s, not Ed Bradley, but Tom Bradley ran for governor of California. And going into the polls, he was up by a significant margin. At the end of the day, he lost. And what people found, and this has also been borne out in social psychological studies, is that individuals, particularly whites, would go into the polls. They would say, you know, I'm going to vote for Bradley. Once they got behind in the polling booth, they just couldn't do it. And some of them actually admitted once they came out, I just couldn't do it. I couldn't vote for a black person. So what we find is that there's actually empirical work which suggests that this is something that happened during the Democratic primaries, that in states like New Hampshire, California, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, where you had a black population that was less than 7% of the total population, there was a Bradley effect, that the polls over-predicted likely voters who would vote, and suggesting that they would actually vote for Obama. In states where you had about 8 to 11% black population, there was really no effect. And in states where you had a greater than 11% black population, especially in states where you had more than 20% black population, there was this reverse Bradley effect where, and it sort of underpredicted likely voters' votes for Obama. And it's usually the case that what we think is that individuals, especially blacks, would say, you know, I'm not going to vote for Obama, in part because they wanted a Democrat in the White House, and Hillary Clinton probably had a better shot. For some black voters, speaking of shot, they didn't want Obama to get shot, and specifically said that that's why they weren't going to vote for Obama. They feared for his life. But once they got in the voting booth, they just, you know, unconscious biases or attitudes were overridden, and they decided that they would vote for Obama. And now this raises a question about reverse racism or reverse unconscious bias. I won't deal with that now, but we should probably touch upon that during the question and answer. Thirdly is the issue about Reverend Wright, and when the story broke about some of his sermons. It's interesting, our sense is that a significant population of Democrats sort of saw Barack Obama, especially whites, saw Barack Obama as the candidate who happens to be black, and we can vote for him. He provides us a bridge to a post-racial America. Now, the Reverend Wright situation created an ordeal where some of these voters realized this is actually a black man, not a man who happens to be black, running for the presidency. And how do we feel now about sort of what we think his racial ideology might be? And lastly is a great body of research, and also some of this coming out of the psych department here at Cornell, looking at the unconscious associations people, particularly whites, have between racial categories and what they perceive as being American. And so there has been a line of research, not specifically focused on the 2008 election, which focused on whites and Asians' unconscious associations between white and American and racial categories. And they tend to unconsciously associate white with American more easily than they do black with American. But with a specific regard to the 2008 election, what we find is that white Americans unconsciously associate Hillary Clinton with images of America, notably the American flag, and they even unconsciously associate Tony Blair with images of America more easily than they do Barack Obama. And more recently, there have been studies that have come out of the psych department here at Cornell, which suggest two troubling things. One is that when you prime individuals, subliminally show individuals images of the American flag, it makes them and so priming studies, let me backtrack, priming studies are also another way to assess unconscious biases. What you find is that when you prime individuals with the American flag, it makes whites like blacks less, it makes them like Obama less, but it doesn't alter their attitudes about Democrats. And so these are some of the ways in which we try to assess unconscious bias in the electorate. I think when we write the final version of the paper, we'll try to use some other variables as well.
Before our question and answer period, we'll have another selection by the Cornell University Chorus. Thank you, Boris. We will now open up the floor for questions and answers. Those of you who may have some difficulty projecting your voices, we ask you to use the microphone here in the middle aisle to present your questions to our presenters.
I think this is a very interesting topic. Of course, One question that I have is about the methodology and the accuracy of polling data, especially today. To reach an 18 to 30-year-old who has a landline, might you get a different response than someone who relies solely on a cell phone? Likewise, to what extent do the pollsters really reach lower SES individuals who might have caller ID on their phones? And if you're able to get through to someone, might not you get a different response? Has there been any work done on the reliability of the polling data today with the new technology?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I actually think that the state of the art now is really in a state of flux in large measure because of the cell phone data. Pollsters have, for generations, tried to estimate the effect of the people they can't get to, or the people who hang up on them, or the like. So I think, in a way, the sort of blocking technology is probably an easier one for pollsters than cell phones, because I think there aren't really nearly such reliable estimates as to the extent of cell phone users that simply cannot be reached. There are estimates, but they're a range. I actually think that there's probably a pollster out there sitting in a very similar position to where we are, waiting for the end of the story, right? That I don't know how many cell phone users we haven't reached, but we need an estimate of that to provide accurate polling. Now, in a way that it is worrisome to rely on unreliable data, and data you know to be unreliable, and that troubles me too. But one thing about the data Greg cited on the Bradley effect, the tendency to overstate a support for a black candidate in a black-white election versus the reverse Bradley effect, it is really striking that in states with very few African Americans, under 7%, you see the Bradley effect. In states with sort of the mid-range, on or about the sort of national average of African Americans, you don't see an effect. In states with a greater percentage of African Americans, you see the opposite. It's certainly possible that the sort of cell phone data makes that sufficiently unreliable that that's not a reliable phenomena. You only get one observation per state, after all, so the data are a bit thin. But the correlation is actually astonishing between the accuracy of the polls and the percent of black population in the state. It's 0.8. You just don't see those kind of correlations in social science. It's really very striking. And so one would have to come up with a theory to worry about cell phone. You should always worry about unreliability, of course. But to come up with a theory for why cell phones matter would have to have something to do with the sort of prevalence of cell phones in these states. Now, I think the sort of access to lower socioeconomic status groups might have something to do with, because a lot of the high African American states are places like Mississippi and Alabama and South Carolina, where you saw the reverse Bradley effect. That may be simply undercounting poor black citizens, right? There may be some of that as well. But the underestimate but pollsters have been aware of that for many decades and have ways to sort of try to estimate that, and they oversample from African American households they can get to, they oversample from poor households they can get to, and the like. So pollsters know about that one. The cell phone one is a little trickier. It's hard to know exactly what effect that's having, but it's hard to have a very good theory for how it's exactly predicting this rather large phenomena of over and under predicting that we saw in the Democratic primary. So worried about it, but I'm not sure it's going to undermine the effect. And in a way, I want to see the outcome of that story too. What are the pollsters going to say when this is done about how well they did with cell phones? There is a sort of strong current right now that the polls may underpredict Obama's support because he does a lot better among younger, wealthier groups who are actually more apt to have a cell phone and no landline, and therefore essentially unreachable by pollsters at the moment. And I don't believe the national polls right now account for that. I think you're exactly right. There was a recent story on that as well, and AP had on that we think we're undercounting those, but by how much will be unclear until after the electorate. I don't know if you wanted to.
Well, one thing I'll add to that is a sort of a general question about our article, which I don't think we've decided whether we're going to crunch numbers at the end of the day or not. and how reliable our argument is. And I think that the approach that we've used is sort of a layering of results, that we don't simply look at the polling data that we've looked at is actually reported on MSNBC's.com's website. We don't simply rely on that, but we rely on multiple polls, and we also rely on these sort of specific instances which raise suggestions that there's at least unconscious race bias taking place out in the electorate that does influence how people have voted and during the primaries and may vote during the general election.
Good afternoon. I wanted to know what are some of the contributory factors or sources that contribute to the black bad, white good unconscious association, in your opinion?
Well, Professor Rachlinski and I talked about this in the article. An interesting thing that you find is that, about 60-some-odd% of Latinos and about 60-some-odd% of Asian Americans harbor this sort of unconscious anti-black, pro-white bias. Anywhere from 70 to 80-some-odd% of whites harbor the same bias, and interestingly, anywhere from about 30% to 65% of blacks harbor the same bias. And so we all seem to be taking in the same bit of information from our environment. And this is a sort of a long story. There's a great history of, not great meaning good, but sort of long history of people of all stripes in America being informed about the negativity of black folks. We see this with Kenneth and Mamie Clark's Brown v. Board of Education study, the study that was used in Brown v. Board of Education, the doll study, in which African American kids pretty much across the board indicated that the white doll was smarter, prettier, more desirable vis-a-vis the black doll. And so all of us sort of take in the same negative information about blacks and comparatively positive information about whites. And to some degree, I think the IAT is a more refined and more useful doll study in this day and age.
Just add a little bit to that. There's pretty good evidence to support Greg's point that the media exposure in the media to a more negative imagery with African Americans than whites lies at the root of that bias. The best evidence is that you can move around the associations, at least on a short-term basis, by exposing people to different imagery. So if you take a white population and show them photographs of high-esteem African Americans, right? You show Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, Tiger Woods, and a number of photos of high-esteem blacks, and then also show some very low-esteem whites, Jeffrey Dahmer and others, in photographs that, at least for the next hour, you don't see the same degree of white good association. Now, it doesn't persist, right? It comes back because the person is then out of your laboratory and back into the same media environment that produced the bias in the first place. But on a short-term basis, you can move it around by creating different associations. You have to sort of work at it, but it can be done. And so that sort of suggests that it is what we're exposed to in the outside world that produces it.
First of all, I want to thank you for the interesting presentation. And I had a question. Is there any available evidence to show that it might be a counter-Bradley effect among white voters, to the sense that they may be more willing unconsciously to vote for a multiracial person such as Barack Obama instead of a strictly African-American person like Jesse Jackson or something?
Well, there's data on unconscious bias suggests that there are some small percentage of whites who harbor an unconscious pro-black, anti-white bias. And so you might say that those are individuals who might vote for Obama based on these unconscious biases. You also might say that there are whites, for example, who have a pro-white, anti-black unconscious bias, but they are explicitly overriding this bias without knowing that they have it. So they might say, I want a post-racial America, and I think having Barack Obama as the president would create a post-racial America. You could have some whites who, Professor Rachlinski and I were talking about this morning, that they would rather eat with a black man than starve with a white man. And so when people people have the impression that Barack Obama, for example, would be a better president. He would help them maintain their job. He would be good for education, so on and so forth. Then they don't use these pseudo arguments that, well, it's his experience, well, it's this, well, it's that, and they come down and they say, okay, maybe I have felt that it's because he's black, but I like to work, I like to make money, I like to eat, I like to have a roof over my head, and at least I think that he might be better on issues which make that more likely. So those factors might override their unconscious biases.
Notice interesting that your question was about unconscious bias in whites. It is true there are a small number of whites who harbor black good preference, but it's really small. So it's not very many. The pro-Obama effect on race that Greg is describing, in a way, really illustrates the sort of two different ways of thinking about candidates. That there's a growing body of evidence that suggests that there's sort of an intuitive way of thinking, and then there's a rational, deductive way of thinking, right? There's sort of your heart and your head, in a way, to be crude about the division, right? That the unconscious bias is really the intuitive part, the sort of the heart part, and that's what we think was driving some of the reverse Bradley effect in the spring. Right, that it's black voters rationalizing, well, I don't think a black man can be elected, I don't think the country's ready for it, and I really want a Democrat, but then you get in there and go, yeah, this is my chance, I'm voting for a viable black candidate, I want to do it once in my life. And that's more, you can sort of see the emotional versus the reason-based side. The sort of voting for Obama as a way of voting for a post-racial America and for what he stands for and the like, is really the head, not the heart, in a sense, right? You got to reason your way there. Or even voting for Obama because you think he'll be better able to deal with the financial crisis is a reason, is this sort of deductive, reasoned way of getting there, rather than an affective, emotional way of supporting him. And so, I guess I'm not seeing, you asked if there was any evidence of the sort of reverse unconscious discrimination supporting Obama, and I don't know of any, but I'd want to think about that some more.
I have a question about the impact or perhaps the influence of the media. The network media covering the campaigns have been very careful and very deliberate, it seems, in some respects. For example, in the Obama rallies, the networks, and showing the crowd shots, have avoided showing large groups of African Americans in the crowds and tend to show other parts of the crowds instead. And in the McCain campaign, have tended to try to show the younger voters more diverse groups rather than some of what we'd associate with some of the other McCain supporters. I wondered if you'd comment on that and the effect that might have on some of these bias issues.
Well, I think your instinct, I think, on this is exactly right. It's sort of the story we sort of are trying to tell in the paper, too, is about Reverend Wright is sort of related to that, right? That after Reverend Wright, or at least for a while, it's clear that Obama is a black man running for president, not a man who happens to be black. For many white voters who will make that distinction, and maybe many black voters too, he does terribly among white voters in the weeks right after that, right? In states where he had been doing, in places where he had been doing reasonably well, he suddenly starts to do very badly. He loses whites in Pennsylvania by 26 points, in Ohio by 30 points, in Kentucky by 50 points. 50 points, it's astonishing. In a way that makes him look more black, right? And your instinct, I think, is crowds of black supporters to a white audience look more black, right? That then starts to feed into that bias. McCain is, of course, the same. You're absolutely right to point out, we hadn't mentioned it yet, that there's a ton of data on unconscious bias in age as well. In fact, the data, if anything, is stronger on unconscious bias in age, right? Although the funny thing about age is it's not unconscious either, right? That people will say things about the differences between older and younger people explicitly and not be shy about it in the way they would about race. It's a little bit more conscious than unconscious as well. I also say, I thought McCain in the debate last week did himself no favor by joking about needing hair plugs, right? You don't play into the bias right? It would be, you're not going to hear, I predict, not going to hear Senator Obama make a joke about how he likes rap music or hip hop. It's not going to happen. He's going to be very careful about that in a way that McCain is not, about making himself look older. That does play into those biases. I don't know what the media's motives are, though. This is not my expertise, but I think your instinct is right. I don't know if Craig wants to.
Well, there are a couple of studies which suggest that when local news coverage focuses on sort of extreme stories about blacks committing crimes, it does sort of ratchet up the level of unconscious bias among individuals. Right. Yeah. And I'm sure that the Obama campaign has been pretty savvy, and I think that they're aware of the fact that they need to project a very specific type of image. And I think there were at least a couple of occasions in which the campaign caught a bit of flack for trying to select or over-select the types of individuals that were behind Senator Obama when he was giving speeches. I know on one occasion it was about a Muslim woman with a headdress in Michigan, and I think that there was one instance in which they said we need more white people back here as well. And so clearly they are aware of the images that are being broadcast to millions of Americans, and they've tried to control that. And I think my sense is that the media are just trying to tell a good story and get as many people to watch as possible. And sometimes that turns on addressing the issues of race. So after the whole Reverend Wright issue came to the fore, that's a lot of what you saw on news coverage, and it didn't benefit Barack at all.
Reverend Wright sells papers, yeah.
Yeah.
Just,
Maybe back to the presentation. My question is about using and the meaning behind the phrase unconscious bias. My experience is that if you actually have a conversation with white people, one in which we've created a somewhat safe environment because they don't feel, or they don't fear the black aggression, they will begin to admit the stories about how their parents told them why my very presence was dangerous to their ascension to the middle class. Or they'll tell you stories about 2 generations ago their forefathers truncated a name so they could assimilate, and how their assimilation was at your expense. So I'm a little confused about why we still feel the need in this day and age to use the phrase unconscious, and if there is some validity to using it, I need a better description.
Well, I tend to make the distinction between lying and lack of awareness. So I think that the implicit association test is good for 2 things. One, to assess individuals' attitudes about any range of categories, but we're specifically talking about race right now. And those individuals who might lie and not tell an observer or someone who's testing them or a black person they're interacting with their true racial attitudes. And it also assesses information that people might not have access to. So you could presumably have an individual who harbors egalitarian values about race. They consider themselves to be very progressive. Some of their best friends are black. And at the core, they find it pretty easy to associate negative imagery with blacks and positive imagery with whites. Does that make them bad people? I don't think so. Does it make them racist? I don't think so. I tend to make a distinction between racist and unconscious, an individual with unconscious bias. So I think focusing on the individual who lacks introspection about their racial attitudes is a more precise way to use the term unconscious bias, as opposed to individuals who aren't that truthful about what they actually know is going on in their head.
And I think you got to think about context too. There are so many contexts that are really economically and personally important in which the decision maker knows that they are not supposed to take race into account. The employment context is a good one. It's got a lot of data to it. It's very important to many people. The interviewers in this study do not report experiencing that they are treating the black interviewees differently. Right? They say, no, I'm supposed to interview, I got to do the best I can, I got to be objective, and in a way that's a double-edged sword. Right? They say, I'm being objective, I'm working hard, I know it, I'm working hard at being objective here. And yet that guy was just more cold, what can I do? Right? And you sort of see that the person really doesn't it's true they may be lying, it's true they may be putting on a charade, but in many cases they know the context and they seem to, that it's supposed to be egalitarian. They're not doing themselves any favor by being biased. They're subjecting themselves out there in the workplace to civil liability and the like. And they don't want to be biased, and yet their behavior elicits what looks like an objective evaluation, but it's not. It's one that has bias creeping into it when they're trying very hard, right? When they're motivated not to do it. I did a study recently on, well, it's been taking a little while, on trial judges, sitting judges who really will never tell you that they are racist, no matter how drunk you get them, no matter how they drop their guard. They're not going to say that. I've tried. It's just they won't do it. And so they're very much on guard, of course. And what we did is we ran a study where we measured their unconscious biases. We convinced them to do that. And we've got a good measure of the degree to which they associate white and good and black and bad. And then we had them make some judgments about criminal defendants. Either the defendants were either white or black. We ran the same scenarios. We just altered the label, white or black, on the defendant. And when we were very explicit about it, we said this is a white defendant or this is a black defendant, we detected no differences in their judgment, and it didn't really correlate with their unconscious biases, right? Because these people were quite on guard. However, when we manipulated the race of the defendant using subliminal techniques, and it's a little technical, but basically what we did is we exposed them to a series of 60 words that are most adults associate with African Americans. And we did it in a subliminal way. They could not detect that's what we were doing. But in prior research, it leads people to get to think that the next thing they're going to see is going to be associated with black Americans. And we then had them make a judgment of a criminal defendant. We either primed them to think about black Americans or we didn't. And it turns out then they did start to make harsher judgments of the defendants if they were primed with black Americans, if they were also high in the white good, black bad association. So that unconscious bias was there. They suppress it pretty well when they're aware and they're on guard, as judges often are, but it was there to be tapped into if you use the right technique. These judges do not know they were doing this, and they indeed deny that they're doing it, and they yell at me and all kinds of stuff. No, you don't know what you're testing, or no, you kind of do. And it is influencing how they think, and they will swear that it's not. And that's what we mean. Now, in a way, your question is about relative importance, and I think that's a good question. It's hard to get at, right? Because indeed, to pollsters and the like, whites will lie about this. We know that's true. And so to what extent is it unconscious bias, or is this bias that they're lying to pollsters about? We know that very few whites in the Democratic primaries said that they voted, that race mattered to them. It's in the range of 5 to 7%. Right? We know it's got to be a bit more than that, and it's conscious. And it's got, but we kind of think that given the numbers, the percentages of folks who have the unconscious biases, that's 4 out of 5 voters. That's a lot of people, many of whom are in this context working hard to think in egalitarian ways and think they do. I guess I just have the example of my mother too, who I don't know which way she's going to vote now, but I know she's being influenced by unconscious biases and she has no access to it. I talk to her every week about it, and she just says, no, it's his experience, his lax experience, his resume, and she, I've gone through this, carefully, deductively with her, and over again, every week it's a new thing that's wrong with Obama. It's something different. It's, I've given up on the experience thing because you were right about it. But now the latest was that he went to some fancy school in Indonesia, and I don't know why that would matter. But, and it's, you sort of get that feel that it's driven and it's motivated. And my mother would tell me, I think, if she were voting against him because he was black. It's very unguarded. She doesn't know I'm going to talk about her. I'll talk later. That has that feel to it, that real resonance, that it's just motivated inference, and she doesn't even quite know why she's doing it this way. But I think that's the unconscious bias we're looking for. And it is too, it's difficult to know how much of that is there as opposed to just the sort of, look, I'm not voting for a black man because blacks are lazy. I know it. I'm not going to reveal it in public. I would quietly, but and I guess it is optimism that we think that the latter is just less common than the former.
This will be our last question.
This is not a question, it's a statement. Thank you for this today. It's very good. I really wanted to come and hear it, and it's been very good. Is Obama black or is he white? He's half white, he's half black, and yet he is portrayed as a black man. Sure, the color of his skin and some of his upbringing and so on. But I think I think the media also loses sight of that he is half white and half black. The other is, I'm so aware of what our from little on up, our cultural training does to us. You've got to be carefully taught to be afraid of people whose skin is a different color, whose eyes are different, who speak a different language, etc. And I'm just mentioning that as a comment, but thank you for this today.
No, thank you.
Well, thank you for that. I do want to say one thing about that. Of course, it's the United States has always imposed the definition of race on people rather than the other way around. But it's not just us. It's most societies do that to most minorities. It's interesting that one of the famous legal cases on race, Plessy versus Ferguson, this is the case that for 60-odd years established that separate but equal was acceptable. The plaintiff in that case was a person who was asked to sit in the back of ordered to sit in the back of a railroad car in Louisiana. And his argument initially was not that the law is unconstitutional, that he should be treated the same way. His argument initially was that he was only 1/8 black and therefore white. He abandoned that fairly quickly because, in fact, there was a statute that said he was black if you were 1/8. It's defined upon them. On the have to be taught race, I mean, in a way, I love your statements, both of them, because they're very optimistic, right? In a world in which we all just saw him as half black and half white, then we wouldn't be having this conversation or writing this paper, right? They have to be taught racism. Unfortunately, the data are it's not that hard to teach, right? We don't know of a society that does not identify a minority and treat them poorly. It just seems to be quite easy to teach. That's a very depressing factoid to end on an optimistic day, but it is true. It's just one cannot identify a group anywhere that doesn't have a minority that they don't like and they don't treat well. And it just seems to be, unfortunately, very easy to teach in the way that language is easy. Language has to be taught too, but it turns out to be easy to do. And it is an unfortunate thing. But I like the optimism the statement expresses.
And the one thing I'll add about whether Obama is black or white or both is that Obama himself says he's black. And so he's sort of conveyed that message to voters. And the other thing is, so in this article that I have out, actually it's with Cornell Robertson, who used to be in the ILR school, on Michelle Obama, and we'll sort of touch upon it in our article on Barack, is this theory under Title VII employment discrimination called third-party associative discrimination, and that is individuals, usually these are whites or white women, who are discriminated against in a workplace, not necessarily because they're white, but because they have a mixed child or because they have a black or Latino partner. So the discrimination really runs to the partner and then back to the individual. And so you find sort of the same thing in this context, that you have Barack, who is trying to be hired for a specific job, and that is president, and he has associated with individuals who people deem as being too extreme, too black. Reverend Wright would be one, but also Michelle Obama. You know, early in the campaign, one of the criticisms about her was that she spoke about issues of race more passionately and more often, and maybe too passionately and too often vis-a-vis Barack. And so to some degree, I think people have associated blackness with Michelle and imputed that sort of ideological blackness to Barack as well at an unconscious level.
Thank you so much.